One of the parts of a new ministry project which can seem the most boring and even a big waste of time is evaluation. Many of us find new initiatives really exciting and we just want to get on with our project. The prospect of having to provide a report on how it's all going can seem really boring and beside the point. It can also seem like a chore if the project has gradually morphed while you've been doing it so that you know that it's changed relative to the original goals that had been set. Those goals can seem like an albatross around your neck, making you feel as though if you were to report on how things are going relative to what you said you were going to do, it's going to look like you're failing. And so, I have felt all of those things. And yet now I can say that I have a renewed respect for doing evaluations based on a recent experience of mine that I'd like to tell you about. Almost 2 years ago, I was called to Lawrence Park Community Church in North Toronto to serve as a co-minister. My chief job was to run a new Sunday night service called Soul Table. It was meant to be a sort of religion-light community gathering for people who didn't like church but crave community. Every night was the same. We would open our doors at 5 o'clock and people would walk into this great big room. It was very welcoming, and we would serve them a free dinner, which they get to eat for about 45 minutes. And while they ate, there's a wonderful jazz band who would play live. And then usually I would be the MC and I would come on and I'd introduce the theme of the night. And over the course of the night we'd have 2 or 3 pieces of music, secular pieces of music played by our band with a vocalist, and we'd have a guest speaker who would talk on various topics. We had sort of like 4 main things which people talked about. One was spirituality, but never mentioning Jesus. Another was social justice. Another was urban issues. And finally, the environment. So all of this was paid for by 2 sources. The Toronto United Church Council gave us money, as did our own church. The Soul Table sessions seemed to be working well, although honestly the numbers were all over the place. Some nights we got 90 people, other nights we would get 25 or 30. And it was unclear to us at first what kinds of speakers and theme nights were bringing the bigger crowds versus the smaller ones. And whether, when we did have really big crowds, whether that would result in people who would ever come back. Because there wasn't much point in having a whole bunch of single nights where lots of people showed up if they never came back again. What we wanted to do was to get people who would repeat, who would slowly come to see this as a community that they wanted to belong to. But one thing was clear to the main congregation of the church, the morning congregation, and that was this was expensive and it wasn't bringing in very much money. Fortunately, we had a mission statement that provided attendance and financial goals for the first few years. And for the first year, our mission statement said that we should expect by the end of 12 months to have an average attendance of 60 people and $14,000 in givings. It was expected that all of this would go up in the years subsequent, but that first year, hopefully 60 people on average and $14,000 in givings. That seemed to be an unrealistic goal while we were holding Soul Table. So there was some anxiety in the congregation that maybe we were just burning money on some pipe dream that wasn't working, and the church's savings were being depleted as a result. Soul Table started full-time in September of 2019. In March of 2020, we had an annual general meeting devoted to the church's finances. And for that meeting, we had to prepare a report on how Soul Table was doing. I asked our staff to provide me with all of the numbers that I would need so that I could create a report, attendance and financial givings and who was coming, ages, that kind of thing. And I must admit that before I crunched the numbers, I feared the worst. However, as I looked at the numbers and I put them into an Excel spreadsheet and let Excel do its magic, I was pleasantly surprised. Here's a graph that shows what kind of attendance we had for each kind of talk. It's color-coded. We found that the social justice and urban issues, the city and social justice nights, tended to do the best, and the spiritual talks did the worst. There were two or three major exceptions for the spiritual talks. We had one spiritual talk for the very first one with a famous author, which just towers above everything else. But once we got to people we could actually afford, we found that the spiritual talks weren't well attended unless they were music nights. We had a karaoke love song night, which was well attended, and a Charlie Brown Christmas night that was well attended. But the ones where we just talked about spirituality, those tended to be the ones that only had 25 or 30 people who came. That was good to know, because we could have easily changed tact and said, okay, we want to switch. We're going to do less spiritual talks and more social justice, urban, environmental talks. And that's something that we could have done. But we wouldn't have known to do it unless we'd been able to look at these numbers. The other surprise was our attendance. After 6 months, we had an average turnout of 44 people. Now, it seemed reasonable to assume that if we'd had another 6 months, we probably could have hit the 60 mark, since we were already 3/4 of the way there. The other thing which was fascinating was that every single night we had more newcomers than we had regular church congregants attending Soul Table. So we were succeeding in bringing in new people always. So that showed that we'd found a way to get new people to come to the church and return, often week after week. And that's a major accomplishment. That's what church growth looks like. The third surprise was our finances. Our original goal had been to collect $14,000 at the end of 12 months. What we found was the money which people had been throwing into the baskets at the front, as well as some one-off donations that had been given to us. By the 6-month mark, we'd made a little over $11,000. So it seemed obvious that we were going to get to our $14,000 goal if we carried on, and probably far surpass it. When I presented these graphs to the congregation at our AGM, there was a clear sense of relief. We were meeting and even exceeding our goals. None of us, including myself, realized this until we had done the boring work of crunching the numbers and spending some time with Excel. This made me appreciate the value of having clear goals that can be used to track progress. When you're in the middle of something, it's very hard to know whether it's going well, and even harder to convince someone else. Having some numbers, some hard numbers like attendance and finances, can go a long way to allaying anxiety, especially when finances are involved. But, something else interesting came out of this. During that AGM, one of our members pointed out that the one thing that Soul Table was not doing well, which it had originally said it was going to do, was to attract people in their 20s and their 30s. And that was true. In our original statement, we said that we wanted to bring young people in. What was happening in practice was that we were attracting people in their 50s and 60s. They saw the point of getting together in community this way, but the 20 and 30-somethings just didn't. But that uncomfortable question from that congregant, which was, raised with everybody listening, was really valuable. Just a week after this AGM, the pandemic hit and we had to shut down our church services. And with it, we also shut down Soul Table. We tried doing it for about 4 weeks online, but, we'd sold this thing as an in-person experience. And that's what our people wanted. They just simply didn't show up at the online experience at all, even though we had all the same elements. We had music and we had guest speakers. They weren't interested. What they wanted was an in-person experience. So after a few months of not doing Soul Table and, learning how to do the whole online experience, I realized, the 20 and 30-somethings, why don't we just meet online? I was still determined to try and get that population into our church, but I realized, well, if they're turned off by church, anything to do with church, like physically going to church, the pandemic was this wonderful opportunity since we'd figured out a way to meet online. So I started a 20 and 30-somethings group online. That started in the fall, and it's still going now. It's been a wonderful experience. There's about 20 to 30-somethings who show up every 2 or 3 weeks is when we meet, and we have fascinating discussions, and people really, really value it. And so had that congregant not posed that difficult question at the AGM, I probably wouldn't have tried to get the 20 and 30-somethings into our church this way. And I'm really glad I did, and I know that they're glad that we did it. So I have come to appreciate the value of setting goals, even when they're based on guesses. I don't know how they came up with those original numbers of 14,000 in givings, 60 average attendance, but they did give us something to measure our progress by. And they can also, those sorts of goals can be very good for morale, so that you can dispel rumors and innuendo. You can't change a plan unless you have a plan, and I am now a fan of having a plan.